This is the story of the engine rebuild in my old BMW Boxer after the melting of the rollers in a big end. I hope you find it useful.
So this is the heart of the problem. I ran out of petrol, although it was actually a blocked vent in the fuel cap. It came to a graceful stop, but it wouldn't kick, and that was the reason. And the cause can be seen here. This is the old slinger plate, which was broken and had been put in with silicone so that oil which spins to the outside, and we can look at it here on the new slinger plate which has been installed. The oil comes from the main bearing, is spun out to the outside. Muck accumulates in the outside, but over quite a long period of time. But then the oil will spill under centrifugal force into the big end here and through holes. And this new plate had to be tapped in quite tightly, so it's a really nice fit, is what you would want. One issue I did have is that the stainless steel nuts to put this on were very tight fit, and there's a danger, of course, that they lose material in the threads and gets jammed in there. So I just had to clean them up a little bit with a dye, and that's in. And so this is the new crankshaft done by BMW bike, Mark Huggett in Switzerland, and it measures up absolutely beautifully, well within the tolerances set by BMW, and all that has to be squeezed in there, although take this plate off first and go into the crankcases. And I've been measuring up very carefully between the main bearings to see what the fit is. It's actually going to be very, very neat. And I'm looking at something like 0.1, 0.2 mil gap between the slinger plate here and the case inside where it adjacent to the main bearing. So I may have to adjust with a gasket here on this cover. But also it did have Kawasaki, I think, pistons in it. And you can see that the valve cutouts are in the wrong place. And these were very loose. The rings had about a 1.5 mil gap in there, which is ridiculous in the bore. Now I've got new BMW pistons, modern design, of course. And that's from BMW bike, Mark Huggett. And the cylinders have been re-sleeved by Serco in Brisbane, and a beautiful job they did as well. So the good fun bit is putting it all back together again. This is Heinrich, who's a BMW R60/2 from 1962. And he's got a single camshaft, and there's an orifice above the bearing carrier orifice up here. This is an R51 from 1938, and it's got twin camshafts, and so a single orifice for the crankshaft, which means it was much more difficult to get the crankshaft in. So these twin camshafts are above the level of the cylinder heads. So you could think of this as a twin overhead camshaft engine, but that would be a bit misleading. Now previously we had the rear main bearing sitting in the crankcase at the back in order to get good measurements for what's going to fit in here, but it's now off and put on the crankshaft before putting the crankshaft in here, and so that is just sitting on top of its bearing carrier at the rear of the crankshaft. So now here we have the bearing carrier for the front with the front main bearing, and we can quite easily pull that in with a sleeve and a few washers. And when that gets tightened up, that will pull the front main bearing onto the front of the crankshaft. And then when we pull the main carrier down, that with a good bit of heat at the back, that will push the crankshaft with its bearing into the main bearing carrier at the rear, and then everything will be tight. And we know that we've got very tight tolerances for the slinger ring, which is, here it is, there's the oil slinger ring right here, and it's going to be very close against the casing at the back, as will the front one at the front, which is the way we want it, with just a little bit of a space there. So that's the front main bearing pulled in with a bit of heat and a bit of percussion. Now this is one of the first 1,500 or so bikes that didn't have a spacer at the front and the back of the crankshaft. Instead, it's got those effectively built into the crankshaft. So you can see the front oil slinger plate there with the feeler gauge. I've aimed for a 0.2 millimeter gap there. The total backwards and forwards movement of the crankshaft is 0.4 millimeters. I've measured, and so I've got 0.2 millimeters also at the rear slinger plate here. So that 0.4 millimeters is probably appropriate for differential expansion, and everything is moving quite freely as it is at the moment and cold. The next thing is to put on this drive sprocket, which will drive the camshafts and the generator. So that's the drive sprocket in, and it articulates with the camshafts, and one of those is in. So you'll notice there's a bit of a cutout here in the front bearing carrier, and you might think that the cutout here in the camshaft mounting is for that, but of course it's not. Be very careful. I noticed I had made a note to myself that that's the top, because that's a little well for oil to pour in and lubricate that camshaft. And one other point I want to make is that you probably saw I had a bearing with these grease seals on it at the rear main bearing. That's how the bike was when I took it to bits, and I was very pleased that the bearing at the back there felt absolutely beautiful, no catching in it at all. When I took the seals off, there was no grease in there, but it was well oiled. So it's an idea that possibly it is a good idea to have grease seals on, and oil can get in, leaking past the seals, but any dirt doesn't get in. But I wasn't going to take that risk, so I put in the rear a proper bearing from Mark Huggett. These are quite expensive. Very good, of course. So the bearings which I had in this engine were only 5,000 kilometers old, so I replaced one of those in the front. And that's potentially quite easy to get at if I needed to change that in the future. Probably more difficult to replace the back one. And that top quality one in the back has got probably a bit more work to do, because there's a very heavy flywheel over here, which gives it quite a lot of weight. There we go. On reassembly, you can see that camshaft is jamming a bit, and that's against the gear for the oil pump. There it is there. If I pull that gear up with its shaft, what happens is that there are spacers put at the bottom of that gear, and the bike only had the one spacer on it, so it must have been jamming a bit as it was running. I find I need 3 spacers to bring that gear upwards to mesh nicely with the camshaft. And so that's what I've done. And I just need to turn that to let it drop, because it's in the oil pump at the bottom. There it is jammed, put in the 3 washers, and it moves nice and freely. Just look out for that. And just as a postscript to that last video, that's the orifice into which the bushing goes. There's the bushing there. This is the one that was on, but it had just had a little bit of play. So I've made a new one, and I've made it a bit longer so that it will reach to the bottom more or less of that hole that you just looked at, which means that if someone else wants to drift it out, they will not mushroom the bottom because it's captive in the hole, and I get a little bit more strength with that, and of course less play. Now you recall I positioned the crankshaft so that it had good free play at either end with the thrower plates, and there's an interesting postscript to that. This plate fits over here, takes oil to the timing chain, but it also has a protrusion here which pushes the bearing well into its carrier. And when I tighten that up, it actually causes binding at the back of the crankshaft so that the thrower plate is hitting the casing. And this is the original bearing that was in there, and the crankshaft is well through that bearing. I did measurements earlier to check that that's the case, and yet this is going to cause binding at the back. And the reason is that the new thrower plate that's in there is almost 3/4 of a millimeter wider than this plate that was in. And I think this is probably wrong, this plate. It may have actually been thinned out a bit somehow. And this is the plate you'll remember has got a broken protrusion and was siliconed in, and it was the cause of the problem in the first place. So what I've done is made, this is a 0.2 millimeter gasket, and I've measured that I've got 0.1 millimeter left to go for everything to be centralized. And I just need to use some of this good Swiss paper here, which is 0.1 millimeter thick, and it'll do that. And so when the crankshaft is pushed forward on here, it acts as a positive stop, and it will be the correct spacing of the crankshaft. There is a wavy washer at the back of the crankshaft, which gives small pressure to push it forward and stop it going too far back, and therefore having fouling of the thrower plate against the casing. But the main effect there is, of course, the clutch pushing the crankshaft forward. The wavy washer is just to encourage it not to move backwards on its own account. So that's all my presumption, and everything will move freely when I've got 0.3 mil spacing in there. I've checked that out, and we'll proceed from there. So there's a bit of a story about the oil pump that might be useful for me to tell you. I was testing the pump using a drill, submersion of the pump in the oil, looking to see what the pressure was by putting this end here into where the oil comes out from, approximately there. And we were hoping for 44 or so psi, and when we look at the diameter of the hole that the little ball bearing goes into, it's 6 millimeters. It's exactly what this drill is, and it fits in very neatly. So the pressure on the spring would have to be approximately 1.92 pounds in order to hold out that 44 psi before it releases. So taking this spring and putting it on a scale and pushing it down the scale, I found that the spring was almost totally compressed at 1.92. You put it down to 2 pounds or so and it's totally compressed. And that gave an unusual result on the scale. What happened is that as I used the drill slowly, the pressure went up to 40 psi. Go a bit faster, it stayed at 40 psi, and a bit faster still, and it went up and eventually got up to 80 psi where I stopped. And what's happening there is that the ball is only able to move back a very small amount because the spring is almost totally compressed and there's not enough room for oil to get back, except when the pressure is just a little bit above the set pressure of about 44 psi. So with the new spring from Mark Huggett in Switzerland, that compresses, it gets easily about 3 pounds or so when it's just moderately compressed. And putting it in here, I have to screw it in a small amount, just enough to get the split pin in, and that gets me to 49 psi. If I go half a turn, I can only adjust by half a turn, then I would get 40 psi. So I chose 49, spec is 44, so I chose 49 rather than 40, and of course being a new spring, it'll probably slacken off a little bit and that pressure will come down. So just look out for that. If your spring is too worn or not appropriate, even though you might get the right pressure at a certain revs, if you have an engine which is cold and the oil's thick and or you're running it at above a certain speed, you could be having oil pressure that's too high. The timing chain went on quite easily, and the top sprocket, which is the generator sprocket, is slightly offset in the generator, so by rotating the generator that adjusts the chain. That all went well. The only issue that I did have from the beginning was that this camshaft on the cam wheel driving the distributor points, it was a little bit loose, and that's because the screw was screwing all the way home before engaging with the camshaft to pull it in, and so that screw was probably a bit too long. However, I put on a washer like this, and that's pulled it up nicely, and the screw's not going to come out with that. The next thing is to put on the distributor and coil, front cover, and then in it goes onto the bike, waiting over here for its engine. And the engine goes in quite nicely. Because I've taken the rear end off, I can just slot the gearbox in without having to move the engine forward. Just one thing I've done here, I've pre-tightened the flywheel on, but I just want to make sure that there's some gap so that this silver part of the crankshaft is countersunk a bit against the flywheel. So to check that, put a parallel bar there, and the distance is 0.02 millimeters between the flywheel and back here, which means when we tighten this up very strongly, it's actually still holding the flywheel on and not going to have any looseness because of the crankshaft protruding. And it's almost the sunset on this job. Everything has gone on quite nicely there with the clutch actuating very well. Gearbox went on well. And just while you're there, I'll show you a little bit of Italian something. And here's a little British boxer. All good fun. So I've taken the option to put 2 very strong magnets in the sump of Wolfgang to collect metal particles and so forth, and I put them at the rear, well out of the way of the metal shroud of the oil pump. I was going to put 3 in, but they fight with each other and I want to make sure they don't move around in there, and so I'm just going to use the 2. And another option is to put them on the outside, as I've done here with Heinrich. And with the sump on the bike and oil in there, sufficient to feed the pump, spin it round, and you can probably see just in the center of the screen oil glistening from the bearings, and it's also the case for the front bearing. And so even though the oil channels were nicely blown out, it's always nice to make sure you can see things happening. Something to just keep an eye on is there's a bit of a shoulder here with the head studs, and that protrudes a little bit and probably helps to center the head on the cylinder, but let's just have a look at that. And you can just see a gap as I move the camera up and down, and that gap is about 3/4 of a millimeter, but luckily the head gasket is 1.5 millimeters, so I think we're okay there. So here's the left-hand side barrel with piston installed. I have been in the habit of putting the piston onto the con rod with the gudgeon pin in place and the clips done, and then inserting the piston into the barrel by introducing the barrel over the piston. And squeezing down the piston rings with my fingers if possible, rather than using a clamp. In this case, of course, I've done it differently because the cylinder is bolted directly onto the crankcases without studs going through to the head. And that means that I would have to hold the barrel firmly while inserting the piston into the barrel and doing the piston rings, which would be too difficult. So this time I put the piston into the barrel on the bench, using my fingers for the piston rings, and then put the assembly together with the gudgeon pin being inserted through the piston and conrod while the piston's in the barrel. And I think that's the way many people do it. I found it to work quite well. And I've got to show you these lovely hairsprings. They have bending motion like this on the steel, and that's probably why they last so well. With coil springs, which they moved to with the R51 too after the war, there's a twisting motion, which means they're probably not quite so robust for longevity. And the tappet cover has to be big enough to cover those hairsprings. And you'll see if we look at Heinrich here, complete with patina, it's considerably bigger, the tappet cover, than the 600, and it's even considerably bigger than the 1 litre, which I'll show you in a moment. And this is the 1 litre engine in my R100R, and you'll see that the 500cc engine tappet cover is considerably bigger in order to accommodate those hairsprings. So Wolfgang is coming together nicely, just a bit to go. There's a gap here in the plunger suspension which will go away when the bike is taken off the stand. And in the plunger suspension are 2 tapered bushes which are made out of Pertinax, a type of plastic. But 5 years ago Greg and I changed those to tapered bronze bushes which we made in my lathe, and that stood the test of time, improving the handling of the bike and looking good after 5 years. Now this bike has got a lovely pair of brass carburetors, a bit rough cast you can see. And I was speaking to Mark Huggett in Switzerland, telling him that these carburetors have got no numbers on them at all. And he said, they must have numbers. Look here, look there. And then I told him that, well, all I know about them is that they came from South Africa. And then he said, well, these are my carburetors. I had them made. So it turns out that Mark organized the castings and also by a separate person the machining, and beautiful machining too. And that's what these carburetors are. They're essentially homemade, but beautifully made and commissioned by Mark Huggett, who's now in Switzerland, but he did it while he was in South Africa. All finished and ready to go. So I'm just showing you my homemade choke, which is adjustable like this. And I had a little bit of trouble with it starting because I flooded it, but using that choke it worked well. And now it's going to start. Going beautifully. Thank you, darling. Give it a bit of a blip. Right, good one.
And here's the bike after about 200 kilometers of running in. Everything going well. Thank you for watching.